Welcome to Property Report UK, your trusted source for the latest housing news, market updates, and in-depth property analysis from across Britain. Today, we're diving deep into a story that goes beyond statistics, a story about how one of the world's most iconic cities, London, has turned into ground zero for a housing crisis that's reshaping the very fabric of British society. A city once seen as the beating heart of a global empire is now facing a crisis of inequality and affordability. More than 1 in 4 Londoners lives in poverty. Homelessness is 8 times higher than the national average. And while families are being pushed onto the streets, nearly half of all property purchases in central London are being snapped up by foreign buyers, many of whom will never even live there. This isn't just a housing issue anymore. It's a system failure, one that's locked an entire generation out of home ownership. Let's start with the raw numbers. The median household income in Britain today is just under £37,000 a year. But the median house price? Around £270,000, over 7 times the average annual income. Now, consider this. Banks typically won't lend to you if your housing costs exceed 30% of your income, the stress threshold that's meant to protect borrowers. But if you do the maths, a typical mortgage with a 10% deposit and a 7% interest rate would cost more than £20,000 a year in repayments. That's more than half of what the average household earns. And here's the catch: if you earn £37,000, you need a bank to buy a house, but the bank won't lend to you because you don't earn enough to afford it. It's a trap with no exit, and millions of Britons are caught inside it. So, how did we reach this point? The roots of this crisis stretch back over 4 decades, to a decision that changed Britain's economy forever. Before 1980, house prices were remarkably stable. In fact, for over 100 years, property prices barely moved after adjusting for inflation. But that all changed with Margaret Thatcher's deregulation of the financial sector. Until that point, most home loans came from building societies, member-owned institutions that lent out money they actually had from savers. But Thatcher's reforms opened the doors for private banks to take over the mortgage market. And banks play by a very different rulebook. When a bank issues a mortgage, it doesn't move money from one account to another, it creates new money out of thin air. That means more money flooding into the property market, driving prices up, and fueling a cycle of debt. From 1980 to 2007, household debt quadrupled, rising from 20% of GDP to 80%. House prices followed suit, climbing at 3 times the previous rate. A home that once took generations to double in value was now doubling every 20 years. It was a golden age for banks and investors, but for average Britons, it was the beginning of a debt spiral that has only tightened its grip over time. Here's how the system traps itself. More mortgage lending drives up house prices. Higher prices let banks lend even more. Speculators jump in, buying homes not to live in but to profit from. That speculation fuels demand, pushing prices higher still. The cycle spins faster and faster until it crashes, like it did in 2008. But even that crash didn't reset the system. Prices recovered, debt climbed again, and here we are back in crisis mode. Walk through London today, and you'll see ghost towers, luxury flats with their lights off night after night. Nearly half of all central London properties are now bought by foreign investors, not residents. To them, London housing isn't a home. It's a safe deposit box with a skyline view. Meanwhile, homelessness in London has reached unprecedented levels. Families are being pushed out to distant suburbs, far from their workplaces. Young professionals are trapped in endless rent cycles, paying thousands each month with nothing to show for it. The dream of home ownership, once a cornerstone of British life, has become exactly that, a dream. So, what can actually be done? Experts have proposed a few bold but realistic ideas that could reverse decades of damage. The first is called Property Income Limited Leverage, or PIL. Under this system, banks could only lend based on the real rental income a property can generate, rather than on inflated market prices. Today, London homes are priced at about 25 times their annual rental income, a ratio that makes no sense economically. pill would gradually bring that ratio down to around 10-to-1, cooling speculation and making housing more about shelter, not stock trading. It would, of course, put downward pressure on house prices. But that's exactly what millions of locked-out buyers need. Of course, lower prices mean political resistance. Many homeowners, especially older generations, have built their wealth on rising property values. That's why a second idea comes in, the Affordable Housing Authority, or AHA. The Affordable Housing Authority would provide zero-interest home loans to buyers earning the median income or less. Here's how transformative that could be. Right now, a typical mortgage for that £270,000 home with a 10% deposit and a 7% interest rate costs about £20,000 a year. But remove the interest and the payment drops to just over £9,000 a year, or 26% of household income. Suddenly, home ownership becomes possible again. These loans wouldn't come from taxes or private banks. The government would create the money directly, just like banks do every time they issue a mortgage. The difference is that this lending would serve people, not profits. Some critics call these ideas unrealistic or even socialist, but they're rooted in solid economic logic. Even Henry Ford and Thomas Edison once proposed similar ideas, warning that interest payments often make financiers richer than the people who actually build things. And that's what's happened to housing in Britain. Banks don't build homes. They just create money, lend it at interest, and collect profits while contributing nothing to the housing supply itself. Meanwhile, private debt has become the invisible elephant in the room. Politicians talk endlessly about government debt, but ignore the household debt that's actually crushing the economy. Between 1980 and 2007, household debt quadrupled relative to GDP. It caused the 2008 crash, and it's climbing again. One radical but increasingly discussed idea is a modern debt jubilee, a system where newly created money is used to directly pay down private debt, reducing household burdens without crashing the economy. It's controversial, but without relief, Britain risks repeating the same cycle: rising debt, falling affordability, and another inevitable collapse. Here's the problem: neither major political party is willing to take these ideas seriously. Both Labour and the Conservatives remain deeply tied to the financial sector. They fear upsetting banks more than helping struggling families. But smaller parties, from the Greens to emerging movements like Zahra Sultana's New Party or George Galloway's Workers' Party, might see an opening. With more than half of Britain's adult population unable to buy a home, a bold housing reform platform could become a game changer. What's happening in London isn't just a British problem. It's a warning for the world. When finance is deregulated, and homes become speculative assets instead of basic human needs, ordinary people lose every time. They lose their homes, their communities, their stability, and their future. London, once a beacon of opportunity, is now a mirror reflecting what happens when financial policy forgets about people. But it's not too late to change course if there's the courage to do so. If you found this deep dive useful, make sure you're subscribed to Property Report UK. We're here to bring you real housing news, not recycled headlines, with the context and analysis that matter to everyday Britons. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next report. And tell us in the comments, what do you think? Could solutions like PIL or the AHA work? What would it take to make our politicians finally act? Because the more people understand what's really happening behind the headlines, the harder it becomes for those in power to ignore it. This is Property Report UK, giving you the full picture on Britain's housing crisis. Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and stay tuned.